Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 433 of the Juicebox Podcast. Today's show is sponsored by Omnipod, makers of the Omnipod tubeless insulin pump. And they'd be happy to send you a free, no-obligation demo. All you have to do to get it is go to myomnipod.com/juicebox. And if you are looking for the most amazing continuous glucose monitor that I've ever seen, you're looking for the Dexcom G6 continuous glucose monitor. And you can learn more about it at dexcom.com/juicebox. Today, we're going to be hearing from a return guest, Dr. Carla Greenbaum, who happens to be running things over there at Diabetes TrialNet. I really enjoyed talking to Carla. I didn't realize how much I had missed her until she got back on. She has a real easy way about her, and I find it enjoyable to speak with her. So she'll be on in a moment to tell you all about TrialNet, but let me just tell you what it says right on their webpage, trialnet.org. Imagine a future without type 1 diabetes. TrialNet is an international network of leading academic institutions, endocrinologists, physicians, scientists, and healthcare teams at the forefront of type 1 diabetes research. We offer risk screening for relatives of people with type 1 and innovative clinical studies testing ways to slow down and prevent disease progression. Our goal is a future without type 1 diabetes. All right, now let Carla explain to you what all that means. But trust me, this is not just some dry, research. You're going to want to hear this. Please remember while you're listening that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Please always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan.
I do want to say that, me personally, I'm of the wrong generation. I don't really do a lot of social media. I don't do any stuff really. Mm-hmm. But I get reports from the team all the time, and they're always highlighting, who do people listen to? And you guys are there all the time. So it's pretty cool what you've created. I think it's pretty amazing, actually.
No, I mention TrialNet all the time when I'm talking, especially when you're talking to parents who have, prospective parents who have type 1 but don't have kids yet. I always ask them, I'm like, would you look? What would you think? I've gotten very, very thoughtful answers on both sides back from people. But anyway, I guess let's just start with obviously I'll do a lead up to it at some point, but sure. Just tell me who you are, give us your credentials and tell us about TrialNet.
So Carla Greenbaum, and I direct the Center for Interventional Immunology and the Diabetes Program at Benaroya Research Institute here in Seattle. And I also am the chair of Diabetes TrialNet.
Wow. And you've had this job for quite some time now, right?
I have. I've been involved in TrialNet, and actually its preceding study, the diabetes prevention trial, since the early 90s. And TrialNet started in 2002, and I was vice chair for a number of years, and then I've been chair. I guess I should remember about 6 or 7 years now.
Wow, that's terrific. So tell me, I guess the overarching goal of TrialNet is what's the thing?
Yeah, that's a good way to start this. So first, maybe just say that what is TrialNet, right? It's NIH funded, your tax dollars, international clinical trial network whose job is to save beta cells, and we do that both before diagnosis, to the idea about prevention, and we also do studies after diagnosis to save whatever beta cells there are left. And, I always think about that. That's really the mission, but the secret to what we really do, or the hint to that, is in our name of TrialNet. We're all about doing trials. That's our essence. That's what we're all expert in. And that's what we really, aim to achieve.
So I guess that on some levels you need people's samples who already have diabetes. And you also, I know you tested my son long time ago now. About 8 years ago, my son got tested and did not have any antibodies that indicated that he might have type 1 diabetes one day. We had to go into my daughter's endocrinologist office to get TrialNet draws. Is that still how it all works?
No, it's completely different. So it's a great question. So maybe I should step back for a minute and just put the frame around this. So TrialNet screens people for the risk of diabetes through our pathway to prevention study. And you can think about that as the funnel. It's the way to test an awful lot of people to find the few people who are unfortunately likely to develop diabetes, because that's really the people that we want to try to see if we can stop or delay the disease. So the first step is this pathway to prevention, which is screening. But as you're talking about, in the old days, you had to go in and get your blood drawn, and you had to go into only a selected number of places. But now you actually can get tested by going online and doing a consent online, and you'll get a kit sent to you. You could test with a kit at home. You could do that at home, and you put it in the kit, and FedEx comes and picks it up, and it's all free. So that is really a huge difference from sounds like when your child was screened a number of years ago.
No kidding. How long have you been able to do it that way?
We've been doing that now for a couple of years. I would say, of course, during this year of COVID, it markedly increased. So certainly during this past year, I'm guessing, don't quote me exactly, but
right.
At least 60, but up to 70% of all people being screened are being screened by doing this online, simple home delivery system.
Does it cost anything on my end?
No. Well, it costs your tax dollars, but it doesn't cost you to participate.
If I just
so that's a really important piece.
If I just ignore what I pay in taxes every year, TrialNet is free.
Exactly. But that's really an important thing, right? We are NIH supported, and all the work that we do is free to any participant, not just the screening, but the follow-up, consultation with people who are experts about diabetes and diabetes risk, and all the monitoring we do to look to make sure whether people are progressing in their disease or not, and participating in all the trials, all that.
Wow. So if I'm making up things now, but if I send if I have type 1 diabetes and my brother's like, well, I want to see if I'm going to get it. We find out he's got some markers. And how many markers are there?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are up to 5 antibodies that are associated pretty reliably with type 1 diabetes. And so TrialNet will test up to all 5. We don't test all 5 right away. We test 2, and then depending on those results, we will test on others. But that's what we would know.
Right.
People who have only one antibody, they just come in on an annual basis to see whether or not, or they come in or provide another blood sample to see whether they are developing more antibodies. Because everything we know now suggests that it's really having multiple antibodies that really puts the individual at risk for progressing. So that's our main group that we're looking for, multiple antibodies.
So if I have multiples, or my friend in this scenario has multiples, what are some of the ways that you try to slow the progression down?
Well, the first thing when somebody has multiple antibodies is that we ask them to come in to do a test to see where they are on that path, right? Whether their blood sugars are still completely normal or whether there's anything already abnormal, because that tells us which clinical trial they might be eligible for. So currently, we are running 2 different clinical trials for people that have multiple antibodies. One is using a drug called abatacept or Rencia, and that trial's been going on for quite a while now, and we're actually anticipating having the results of that trial before the end of 2021. And the second trial, the one that we're still recruiting for, is using a drug called hydroxychloroquine, which has nothing to do with COVID for the purposes of our study.
We now all know what it is. So
yeah, we know what it is. But the good news is it is an oral medication that people can take. And so people who have multiple antibodies and have normal glucose can be in the study. And the idea is to figure out whether hydroxychloroquine can slow or delay people progressing to getting diabetes. And it's a really interesting drug because it's been around for more than 50 years for totally other purposes, but it is now widespread use for people who live with arthritis, which of course is another autoimmune disease like diabetes. And that's true in both kids and adults. So there's lots and lots of information about this drug. And all of that suggests that it could slow disease if it's given early on. And so that's why we're doing that study. And that's ongoing right now.
Is that medication what it does centered around inflammation?
Yes. Yes. So to a certain extent, hydroxychloroquine works about, let me how to explain this. There's different, of course, arms of the immune system. And one of the early steps in autoimmunity, we believe, is what we call turning on the innate, INNATE, immune system, which is like your immediate response. And this is what we think hydroxychloroquine interferes with, and why we hope it can slow the disease.
If a person has multiple antibodies, are they definitely going to get type 1 diabetes at some point, or is that not necessarily the case?
That's a great question, because as you know, this whole notion of stages of diabetes, which means that once you have multiple antibodies and you have normal glucose, you're at what we call stage 1 diabetes. And if you have multiple antibodies and your glucoses are not quite normal, that's stage 2. And stage 3 is what we used to call new onset diabetes. And that whole framework was really based on all the studies that do suggest that, unfortunately, once you have multiple antibodies, it's extraordinarily likely that you will get clinical type 1 diabetes. Now, the important piece that people often miss, it doesn't tell us when you're going to progress to getting type 1 diabetes. Some people may live with multiple antibodies for a long time, and other people will get diabetes in a short period of time after the antibodies appear. So it's the antibodies that tell us who to test further to see who's going to be getting diabetes sooner, to see about who could be in our trials.
Gotcha. And this is just the point where I mentioned we're talking about type 1 in case.
Yes, as type 1 diabetes. Yeah. And you know, I should say that the study that TrialNet conducted, where we showed that one of the drugs that we tested, teplizumab, could slow progression in people that were at risk for getting diabetes, you know, half the people who had received the placebo got diabetes very, very quickly within 2 years. So when I say that just having antibodies doesn't tell us how long it takes you to get diabetes, it's really having antibodies and doing these other tests that we can help give you information.
You know, I have to say that I've now interviewed a number of people who have gotten it in their 60s.
Yeah.
And I feel like a decade or two ago, someone would have told you that was impossible. But I've just talked to too many people who've had it happen. And I think at this point now, if I should have made a flow chart at one point in my life, I've probably spoken to somebody who's been diagnosed at every age between between the newborn and like in their mid 60s. So it's nobody ever, I mean, don't get me wrong. There's sweet spots, it seems like, where people are like, you know, they're all like always like 28 or just getting ready to go to college, or, you know, like there seems to be, I mean, this is very unscientific, but there seems to be some sweet spots where it happens. But I've had somebody say every age that I can think of. So
you're absolutely correct. Yeah. So what you talked about, the sweet spots, is what we talk about bimodal distribution. That's a fancy science word, which basically says, if we look at when people get diabetes, there's sort of the group of people that get it really sort of pre-puberty, kind of 6 to 10-year-old range. And then there's another blip around puberty that people get it. But then we do know, people like you found, right? People get diabetes at all, type 1 diabetes at all stages. Yeah. What we don't know, for example, is somebody, let's say they have just one antibody now. People that we test who only have one antibody, we know about 20% of them will develop more than one antibody after about 5 years. But we don't know if the other 80% will eventually get multiple antibodies or will develop diabetes with having only one antibody decades later. We, you know, because we haven't followed people 60 or 70 years, right? Yeah. We don't know that for sure.
Wow. What about having other autoimmune? Like if you have a different autoimmune issue and have an antibody, does it change your odds?
What changes your odds is your genetics, right? So your genetics is what sets up any autoimmune disease. And if you have another autoimmune disease, that means you have the genetics that put you at potential increased risk.
Gotcha.
But once you have multiple antibodies, diabetes-related antibodies, the genetics don't seem to matter that much.
Gotcha. Okay.
So it really, the genetics tells you who's going to have antibodies, not who's going to progress once you have antibodies.
My last go. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, I didn't mean to stop you. If you have something else to say, keep going.
I was just going to say that's really why TrialNet focuses on screening relatives, right? Mm-hmm. Because we know that's a genetic screening test. If you have a relative with diabetes, that means the genes are in your family more concentrated.
Right.
And if we screen, we will find about 1 out of every 50 relatives will have multiple antibodies. It is true that people who never had a relative will get diabetes, but we'd have to screen 750 people who do not have a relative to find that one with multiple antibodies.
That's interesting. Let me ask you this. Can I pluck 2 people off the planet who are married and we screen them and find out if their children have more or less of a chance of having type 1?
Not really, because the genetics give us, I think, what we call a fertile field, right? Mm-hmm. They give a probability, but they're not like genes that cause particular kind of breast cancer or Huntington's chorea. In other words, monogenic diseases, right? They don't say you're going to get it.
I see.
So we could give some ideas, but we can't give enough information. We know some genes that are associated with getting diabetes, but there's a lot of people who have those same genes who never will. So genetics alone doesn't help us. On the other hand, as I mentioned before, we do know about what happens in relatives. So if you're an identical twin, the risk is very high. If you're a child of a father with diabetes, the risk is higher than if you have a mother with diabetes. So we do have that kind of subtle information.
Are you learning about how does diabetes skip generations, or is it just random?
Scott, it's so funny how often people ask me that. No, it does not skip generations.
Gotcha.
So that is not true. I don't know why people get that idea. I hear it all the time.
Yeah,
so
it's anecdotal. It's just anecdotal because probably what you just said is you're more likely if your father has than your mother has. So maybe your father has it. You have a daughter who doesn't have it, who then has a son who then does have it, and then it makes it feel like it's skipping a generation.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I don't mean to be. I don't mean to be light about it, but in general, no. Unfortunately, that's again why we screen first degree family members. That is immediate family. We'll screen people up into age 45, where second degree, we actually only screen to age 20 because the risk becomes lower the further genetically you are from the person with diabetes.
After the obvious goal of helping people who you screen and find, what are other goals of TrialNet? Like what else am I helping to do by being
great question. So one of the things is that we're helping is that we are providing hope and support for people, right? If you have somebody with diabetes in your family, you are worried about other people in your family. And most of the time you'll get pretty good news, right? Because only about 5% of people will have antibodies. But if somebody is antibody positive, we're kind of there for them, right? It's like when a physician has to give bad news to anybody, this is bad news to let people know that, unfortunately now you have multiple antibodies, but we're there to monitor and follow them carefully and provide opportunity and to have them prepare if that diagnosis will occur if a trial is not available for them. But on a broader scale, what we provide and what participants provide to everybody else in the future is every bit of data we get from any study we're doing is really laying the foundation for the future studies. So TrialNet was based on some of the studies that were literally started in the 80s, where we studied every family member we could find to measure everything we possibly could. And that's what led to this whole notion about what predicts risk. So we learn about the natural history of the disease. We get a better understanding of who's more likely to respond to certain therapies. We really learn a lot from everybody who participates.
Yeah. It's, I find it encouraging and whimsical to think about that somebody started something in the 80s that's helping somebody in 2021. And I can see how also somebody would think that and go, oh, great. So they'll figure this all out 10 years after I'm dead. But you really are in What it reminds me of is that I interviewed somebody who works at NASA recently, and I ended up asking, what does it feel like to be involved in something that you may never see the fruition of your work? And I guess I feel drawn to ask you the same question.
Well, I'll have to throw in a famous Talmudic saying from the Jewish tradition, where it's a Hasidic story, which basically somebody goes to this old man who's planting a tree, saying, "What are you planting the tree for? You're not going to see it happen." He said, "Nope, but my grandchildren will." And that this is all about, thinking beyond myself and thinking about the future. And that's what we do. I mean, all research is this way. We all have little pieces in this puzzle. And, the cliche of standing on someone else's shoulders is what we do.
Yeah.
So I must say that I'm super excited in my research lifetime how much has happened, right? We went from not knowing what could predict, and now we can predict. That was like, we couldn't do that before.
Right. It's a huge
We
step.
went from not having anything to do about it to now we have a therapy that's now been shown to stop diabetes.
Yeah.
Now, in fact, there are 7 different therapies now that can alter the disease course in diabetes. 7.
Wow.
There were none that long ago. So it's a little piece in the puzzle. We haven't gotten to the destination of curing diabetes yet, but boy, we've made a lot of changes.
Yeah. I always imagine that the end goal for all these different things, like you can use curing diabetes as an example, but the end goal for something, I imagine, will never be reached the way the person in the moment now thinks it's going to be reached.
Yeah.
Do you find that you learn things along the way that reframe your thinking about how to reach that end goal?
I love that. That's a fabulous way of thinking about it. I think.
And Carla, I don't even smoke weed. I just came up with that on my own.
I was just going to say that's like totally, 60s thinking. No, I'm teasing. I would say the answer to that is, whereas much of science progresses in increments, right? Mm-hmm. Where we build on an observation somebody made and we test that further and we build on another observation. There are certainly times where there are paradigm shifts, right? Where somebody came up with a whole new way of either looking at the same data or has a new tool to measure something differently. So you're right. I don't know what the future of this is going to look like. I hope there are clever people in the future who will, change the paradigms a little bit and advance things even further.
Yeah. It makes you feel inside, if you're being whimsical, that one day someone will be able to say, "Oh, you have an antibody in your system that you don't want. We'll just take it out. We'll just put this thing in here that goes and finds it and kills it,"
Like I said, I'm old enough to know when the whole idea, when Amazon was first starting to sell books online, I live in the Seattle area, and I was and there was an opportunity to invest, and I was telling my husband, "That's ridiculous. No one's going to give a credit card to somebody online."
Well, I don't know that people understand. It's funny. We were just talking about this in my kitchen the other day, where I was explaining to Arden how quickly technology builds on top of itself.
Yeah.
And, I'm standing around with my kids who are 16 and 20, and I told them this story. I said, when I was 13, I bought the most advanced consumer computer that existed. And I was like, I took it home and I bought a book at the bookstore that had code in it. I spent an entire day of my life looking at the book, typing in this code. It went on forever and ever. And I got done and I pushed enter and nothing happened. So I went back and I read the book and looked at the screen, and it took me hours upon hours, and I found my typo and I fixed it and I pushed enter, and a stick figure did one jumping jack on the screen and stopped. And I have to tell you, it was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen in my life. All right, let's get into these ads and get back out quickly. Short episode, short ads. The Dexcom G6 continuous glucose monitor will show you the speed and direction of your blood sugar in real time. It will stop you from having to do finger sticks to know what your blood sugar is, and it will allow you to make decisions about insulin and food in a more precise and targeted way. And those decisions can easily lead to more stable blood sugars. Just imagine knowing how to balance your insulin against your food, or seeing a small low come up and not over treating it with food because you can kind of watch it happen. You say, let me just try drinking a half of this juice box instead of the whole thing. This is amazing. On top of that, you can have up to 10 followers. So somebody can be wearing the Dexcom G6 and share their blood sugars if they want with up to 10 followers. This is for Android or iPhone, and it's fantastic. I can get my phone out of my pocket right now and tell you what Arden's blood sugar is. And it is 119, and it's stable. I can see it's been stable for quite some time. That quickly. If Arden's blood sugar leaves the range that we've set, which interestingly for this is 120 or 70, I'll get a little alarm. Yeah, beep, beep. Arden's blood sugar is going above 120. And then we make a small adjustment to her insulin and bring it right back again. There are almost countless ways that you can use the information coming back from the Dexcom G6. Why don't you head over to dexcom.com/juicebox and take a harder look at it. See if it isn't something you think you might enjoy. And if you're a U.S. military person getting your insurance through the VA, I think you're going to be super happy with the coverage. So you guys should head over too. There's a quick little form to fill out, and Dexcom will get right back to you, and a ton of information that you can look at on your own. Speaking of forms to fill out, if you go to myomnipod.com/juicebox, you can fill out a short form that will result in an Omnipod demo coming directly to your house. There, you or a loved one can try it on and wear it and see what it would be like to wear a tubeless insulin pump, not to be connected to any tubing or controllers, and still get the delivery of insulin that you deserve, meaning basals while you're bathing, while you're swimming, during activity. Being able to fine-tune that basal insulin, right? Not just inject it once a day and hope for the best, but be able to create basal programs like, I don't know, I want 0.5 an hour from midnight to 6 a.m., but at 6 a.m. I want it to be 0.7 or whatever. You're in control of that. You're also in control of temporary basal increases and decreases, extended boluses, and all kinds of ways to help with your insulin delivery to, again, be more targeted to your needs. Plus, it's tubeless. So you're not going to get wiring. You're not going to get tubing caught on doorknobs, dresser handles, or have to take it off to bathe, swim, or be active, or do adult activities. myomnipod.com/juicebox. Get that free, no obligation demo sent to you right now. Listen to what I'm saying. Free, no cost to you, no obligation. Means you don't like it, doesn't matter. That's risk-free in my opinion. There are links to Omnipod, Dexcom, and all the sponsors at juiceboxpodcast.com right there in the show notes of your podcast player, or you can type them into a browser, myomnipod.com/juicebox, dexcom.com/juicebox. And while we're talking about links, don't forget TrialNet. They're not a sponsor, but Carla's here today sharing the news, so trialnet.org. And a stick figure did one jumping jack on the screen and stopped. And I have to tell you, it was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen in my life.
Yeah. Well, I would say that, the advances that happen in science are obviously not as touchable for the average person, like all the technology has changed our world.
Yeah.
But if you look back with a little bit of a broader lens, the difference between what science has brought to healthcare and medicine now versus when I was at med school, which wasn't that many centuries ago, it's night and day.
Yeah.
And so I really do believe in science.
I have to tell you that when my son was 2, so we're about 18 years ago, I'm 49. Let me do the math real quick. I think that made me like 36 or 37-ish in there, maybe 47. Nope, 27 or 20.
26.
All right, there we go. My appendix almost burst. When my wife was a child, she had terrible ear infections. And when my daughter was 2, she got type 1 diabetes. And you can go back in time not that far and make the case that all 3 of us would have died. We wouldn't be alive today, without just basic things that have moved forward. Really fantastic. And it's just, I've always been thrilled to tell people about TrialNet. And and then we get into that space, right? Where, I do believe that people need to understand the benefit of finding out that they have the antibodies, because I get afraid that when people hear about it, they just think, well, I don't want to just worry, like wait for the other shoe to drop. Yeah. And I've also heard people thoughtfully say, guests on this show, listen, I have type 1 diabetes. I've had it for 30 years. There's nothing wrong with me. I have a very normal life, and my kids could have a normal life too if they had it. Except the idea that you could maybe take a pill that could exponentially slow the onset down or even stop it. I mean, that to me is where the exciting part is.
Yeah. I mean, I again, look, participating in research is not for everybody. And it's really hard to do it when you're making decisions for your children, for example, as compared to for yourself, right? On the other hand, all the money in the world is not going to bring progress if we can't have people participating. So every single person who steps up to participate just is accelerating our ability to test new therapies and to find new things. And yet I know it's a challenge. I guess the only other comment I would make is that research in other areas where families have one child with a chronic disease, for example, has well documented that the other children in the family are wondering about them getting it as well. So sometimes parents say, I don't want to scare my other child. I don't want them to think that they might be at risk. What we know from all sorts of other studies that they're thinking about that anyway, whether they're saying it out loud or not.
Right.
And the other thing is that, going back to the 60s, knowledge is power. So I think when people know that they're antibody positive, there's obviously a sorrow and grieving process around that, but it's such a wonderful opportunity to be able to prepare and to not have to, end up in the hospital with DKA or something.
No matter how many people I speak to who are misdiagnosed type 2 and eventually find out they're type 1, they all, I think I really mean all of them, eventually say it is better to know than to struggle or to wonder. They use words very similar to that. I've never heard anyone say, I would have liked to have gone on thinking I had type 2 diabetes when I really had type 1. And I'm just a big fan of that. Like in my mind, a bill comes, whether I think I can pay it or not, I open it up to find out what it is, because now at least I know. Staring at the envelope closed, you don't forget it's there. You just, you're just putting off the inevitable. And maybe, I don't maybe I open it up and realize, oh my God, I paid too much last month. This one's a freebie. I get a whole month, get a whole month of thinking my water bill's paid already, it just, to me, it's a mindset.
Yeah. Let me throw out a number for you to, for you and your people listener to think about this, that there's about 40,000 people that are newly diagnosed with type 1 diabetes every year in the United States. If each of them had on average 3 relatives, that's like 120,000 people, right? Which would be 3,000 people that would be identified potentially who have multiple antibodies. If we had that group of people regularly, we would be able to do all the trials much more quickly, and we would get the answers much more quickly.
And that would help everybody. People who
helps everybody.
Yeah. I have to say, not to mix my apples and my oranges here for a second, but I support the T1D exchange. And I sometimes struggle to explain to people why that's important. Like, to say to somebody like, oh, they took data and that helped the ADA bring down the A1C guidelines for children. And you hear that, and it could be very easily, you could hear that and go, what? Like, what does that matter? But it does matter, because when the ADA says, look, this should be a target, then every endocrinologist in the country reframes their idea of health. And even though it's a slow, it's like turning a battleship, eventually that means that everybody gets more targeted information about how to manage their blood sugars. And, everybody can't listen to this podcast. I wish they could, and I know what happens when people listen to their variability and their A1C and their overall health. Like, having good information and good tools is the answer. But doctors, they take their marching orders from somewhere else, like largely. And so that's a hard thing to explain in a soundbite. And I think maybe you suffer from that sometimes too, trying to say like, look, if this many people times this many people would equal 3,000 more people, you have no idea how helpful that information would be to helping everybody. But now we've said it, so now they just have to believe it.
Well, you'll just have to say it 3 or 4 more times, because that's exactly the point. I mean, it's we need people to help us help them. That's really what we need. Right. And our job is to do the best studies we possibly can, and to do the best we can to support people who are volunteering, for participation. But we need people to participate. That's for sure.
But Carla, aren't you just going to take my blood and make a race of lizard people and invade Mars with them?
Listen, I think there is, among the tremendous tragedy that COVID has brought to the world, there have been quite a few silver linings. And I think one is a little bit more insight into science and what science can help and offer people, is much more in the so-called public square than I think it's been in the past. And I hope people see that. Yeah. We actually were involved in running we were a site for the Pfizer vaccine trial this past year. We had more people wanting to volunteer for that than anything we've ever done. And I, reflected on that. Why is it? It's because people saw it as an emergency.
It's imminent.
And people saw it as a public good. They saw how terrible things were and felt that they could contribute to making it better.
Yeah.
So maybe what we haven't explained clearly enough to people is that contributing is how it's going to make it better in diabetes.
Yeah, and it doesn't take that much effort. I mean, honestly, I had to go into an office to do it that day, and it wasn't that big of a deal. And now you're saying, I just went to your site. So I go to trialnet.org, and then I want to
participate now.
I see that. And then, it's easy. I click sign up. And it says you can get an at-home test kit, visit a Quest Diagnostics or LabCorp, and that's it. Okay, so this seems pretty simple. And you put pictures of cute children on there, which is always a smart thing for a website.
Well, we do have an awful lot of people have participated over the years that are really passionate and eager to tell their story. So we like to do that, and we anticipate doing that quite a bit more coming in the next quarter. Yeah. We'll have a whole new campaign where we're telling people's stories and why they participate and what their experience has been in TrialNet.
That's excellent. It really is. I don't know. I don't know how to get through to everybody. Like, there's times I just think like, just do it. just go do it. Like, even if let me ask you a question. If I wanted to help this is going to sound crazy because it probably isn't going to work out the way I'm thinking of, but if I want to help the overall cause, but I don't want my results, can I do that?
No.
Because it would be medically unethical for you to know something about me and not help me?
Well, it just doesn't help me as much, right? Because we already know, if we got your blood sample and you had antibodies, we already know what that means. We're not going to learn anything from that.
Gotcha.
What we need is for people to be ready to be in studies to see if we can slow or delay the disease.
Right.
So I appreciate the sentiment. And I should say, if you lived in Seattle, we would love to have your blood, because we do an awful lot of work here just at Benaroya Institute to use blood samples from people living with diabetes to understand the disease. So we're not running a clinical trial like TrialNet is.
But if I wanted to just drop off some blood at the institution that's separate of TrialNet, I had type 1 diabetes, I could do that?
Yeah, we have, well, you don't just drop it off, but yes,
wait.
You have to stop it.
Carla, in my mind, I roll up to the curb and I just toss it out the window and you
Yeah.
It's not like that, you're saying?
It's a little more than that. But yes, the reason why some of the trials that we conduct, we have decided to do because of what we learned from studying blood samples and people living with diabetes.
I gotcha.
So, all these different ways that people who have diabetes can contribute. Again, it's not really what TrialNet does in terms of people living with diabetes, but we do learn from samples all the time.
Well, it's an amazing thing. Like, the work you're doing is, it's astonishing. And I do think it'll come to some or a lot of good one day. I am, I have to say that for me being the parent of a child with type 1, I live like diabetes won't be cured in my lifetime. I hope it will be. Like, I always have the hope, but I prepare like it won't be, because I get super afraid for people who have that feeling like, oh, don't worry, they're going to fix it soon. I don't have to take care of myself right as well. And I'm always worried about that balance a little bit, but that's what we've kind of struck here. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if I turned the news on one day and some guy's like, yeah, I used that CRISPR. It turns out you just do this and this. And, you know, like, and at the same time, if, I know I'll never know, but I tell you right now, if I send somebody to TrialNet through this podcast and 100 years from now, kids don't have type 1 diabetes anymore, I hope I can feel that wherever I am, because you know what I mean?
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. I love that sentiment. And I would say that we do rely on people like yourself who are passionate, not only about helping people with type 1 diabetes, but sharing information. I think that's really why the type 1 community is so amazing. Do appreciate that kind of work.
You have to scale it.
Before we leave, I should tell you about our new study, though. Is that okay? Do we have a minute?
What, are you kidding me? What are you thinking? I'm busy or something? It's COVID. I'm just going to stand up and walk into another room after this.
Well, I've got backup calls, but we're okay for a little bit. Go ahead. Listen, as I spent this whole time, right, we're all about doing prevention, right? Mm-hmm. But one of the other pieces that TrialNet is now doing is looking out at different types of therapies that different companies are starting to think about developing. And we're going to those companies and we're saying, look, TrialNet can do these studies for you. We can help move it along. We can bring it from the early steps to the next steps to the next steps. And so I'm really excited about this new study. So it's a phase 1 study. Phase 1 means the first time the drug's ever been given to people. And it's just therefore testing to make sure it's safe and helps us select what are the kind of doses we want to use, right, for the bigger trial. But this phase 1 study, if the results are good, is what's going to lead in the future, the next step to prevention. So for this study, this is looking just for adults, because phase 1 means, again, only first time in people. So we don't give these therapies to children. And we're looking for adults who were within 4 years of diagnosis. And we're going to be giving them a therapy that I kind of call a designer drug. So it's a designer drug for diabetes that we're testing in this group of adults. So if people, particularly people who live near a TrialNet center, that would be really great. And again, you should be able to read about that on our website as well, under new onset studies.
Under new onset studies.
It's called TOPPLE is the study.
Spell it?
TOPPLE.
Okay. Well, I will make sure. I'll put links to everything in here for that.
Okay.
That's excellent. I'm glad you told me about that. Yeah, I mean, it just makes sense, right? You're doing the work already, and they're looking at the same things. You might as well. I have to say that I had a gentleman on, Dr. Millman, you know Jeffrey?
I know of him.
Do you really? Okay. I had him on a couple months ago. And one of the things that it came away from, that I came away going, wow, that's crazy, is that how much more scientific minded people are now sharing what they learn. And it's become less about like, we'll just, if we get it, it's ours. And it's more about, about people being able to dig into other people's research and do labs helping labs and everything. And I really do forget the actual like specifics of what he said, but it left me with a good feeling of, if somebody's having a good idea over there and someone's having a good idea over there and they're not talking, it seems like a waste of time, so.
Well, there is this, old image of a scientist, locked in their dark laboratory and, never talking to everybody. But certainly clinical research is 100% a network, right? A collaboration. I mean, TrialNet has hundreds of sites, thousands of people that are involved in making this work. Yeah. So it's really all about communicating with others and building bridges, for sure. Well, isn't Millman at WashU?
He is. Look at you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I forget why I ended up having him on, but something he said on Twitter or somewhere, I forget where I saw it. I was like, I'm going to ask that guy to come on the podcast. And then he was just delightful. And what he talked about was just very aspirational. And I think it's one of the things he said was like, the thing we're doing right now was just unheard of a short time ago. Like this is something that nobody could have even imagined. And that to me is exciting. The idea that things are exponentially growing and scaling and
right.
You know.
And the cool thing is that a scientist like himself who's developing new therapies will be able to, something like TrialNet takes those and tests them in people. That's why I'm saying it's like, it's a village, right? It's a whole community of different people using their skills and interests who then pass that idea along for the next stage. That's what it's all about.
Hey, a huge thanks to Omnipod and Dexcom for sponsoring this episode of the Juicebox Podcast. Find out more about that Omnipod tubeless insulin pump at myomnipod.com/juicebox. And of course, the Dexcom G6 continuous glucose monitor. You can learn about that at dexcom.com/juicebox. You can get your free T1D risk screening from TrialNet at trialnet.org. And you can also find out about those other studies just the way Carla told you about. Why don't you check it out at trialnet.org? That was pretty good, right? I'm done. I did everything I need to do here. Let me take a minute to thank everybody again for the great ratings and reviews that you've been leaving on Apple Podcasts and wherever you listen to the podcast at. Thanks so much for sharing the podcast with other people, for joining the private Facebook group, which of course is always free. Everything about the podcast is always free to you. Checking us out on Instagram or wherever else you follow along. Let me just put this feeler out. If you're an endocrinologist who recommends the show to people, I would love you to come on and talk about that. You could be completely anonymous if you wanted to. I can't offer a voice changer, although I don't know that I can't figure out how to do that. But you could be anonymous. I would love to hear from an endocrinologist that suggests this podcast to patients. So if you're that person, reach out, find me. I'd like to know more. There's going to be one more episode this week, and then next week there's going to be an After Dark, and what else? I have a lot of really cool episodes edited. Which one am I going to give you next week? So I think this weekend, maybe Sarah, maybe Meredith, maybe Galen. Maybe Galen this weekend. Next week, an After Dark with Josh and Sarah later in the week. I think that's what I'm going to do. Then there's a How We Eat coming up next, like 2 weeks from now. And another After Dark coming the month later. That's what I'm going to do. Yes, I've just talked myself into it. Now let's see if I can remember what I said the next time I go to put up an episode. Anyway, thanks so much for listening, guys. I love making the podcast for you. Thank you for listening. It means the world to me. I'll talk to you soon.